The world exploded in slow motion. Scot Dowson felt his body separating from Thunder's massive back at the worst possible angle, his right shoulder slamming into the arena wall with a sickening crack that echoed through the AT&T Center like a gunshot. 65,000 people rose to their feet in unison, their cheers transforming into gasps of horror as they watched a man's life change forever in the span of a heartbeat. Thunder's final buck had been perfection incarnate. 2,000 pounds of pure malice launching skyward and twisting midair with the precision of a tornado. Scot's body, already pushed beyond human limits by 7 seconds of violent punishment, simply couldn't absorb the physics of what the massive Brahma bull had unleashed. His grip on the bull rope, strengthened by 15 years of professional competition, finally failed him when he needed it most. The impact with the concrete wall compressed Scott's spine like an accordion. His protective vest, designed to shield his ribs and organs, proved useless against the crushing force that drove his lower back into unforgiving stone. The crack of vertebrae breaking was audible over the arena noise, a sound that made veteran cowboys in the crowd wince and look away. Scott's body crumpled to the dirt in an unnatural position, his legs twisted beneath him at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Thunder, his job completed with devastating efficiency, gave one final kick that missed Scott's motionless head by mere inches before trotting toward the exit gate, steam rising from his black hide in the February cold. The arena fell silent except for the electronic whine of the buzzer that had sounded just as Scot lost his grip. 8 seconds. He had made the full 8 seconds on the most dangerous bull in professional rodeo, but the victory buzzer now sounded like a death knell echoing through empty air. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. The voice belonged to Marcus Rivera, Scott's best friend and traveling partner, who was already sprinting across the arena before Scott's body had finished falling. Marcus reached him first, dropping to his knees in the dirt, and immediately understanding that this was different from every other wreck he'd ever witnessed. Scott's eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the arena lights without seeing them. A thin trickle of blood ran from his left ear, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Most terrifying of all was his absolute stillness. No groaning, no attempt to roll away from the dirt, no instinctive movement that should have followed such a violent impact. Don't move him. Dr. Patricia Williams, the rodeo's on-site physician, arrived seconds behind Marcus, her medical bag already open. She'd been covering rodeos for 12 years and had seen broken bones, concussions, and torn muscles, but the way Scott's body lay motionless in the dirt triggered every emergency protocol she'd ever learned. Nobody touch him until we get a backboard. The arena announcer's voice, which had been building the crowd's excitement just moments before, now carried the weight of disaster. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a rider down. Please remain in your seats while our medical team attends to Scot Dowson. In section 214, 8-year-old Emma Dowson pressed her small hands against the glass barrier, her pink cowboy hat askew from jumping up and down during her father's ride. "Mommy, why isn't Daddy getting up?" she asked, her voice small and confused. "He always gets up." Sarah Richardson, Scott's ex-wife, felt her nursing training war with her maternal instincts as she watched the father of her child lying motionless in the dirt. She could see from their elevated position what the crowd couldn't yet grasp: the unnatural stillness of Scott's lower body, the way his legs lay exactly where they had fallen without any sign of voluntary movement. "He's hurt, sweetheart," Sarah managed, pulling Emma close as paramedics flooded the arena. "But the doctors are going to take good care of him." The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, immobilizing Scott's neck and spine before carefully rolling him onto a backboard. His vital signs were stable but concerning. The head trauma was obvious from his dilated pupils and the blood trickling from his ear. More ominous was his complete lack of response to pain stimuli below his waist. Possible spinal cord injury. Dr. Williams called to the paramedics as they prepared to transport him. "We need to get him to University Hospital immediately. Call ahead and tell them we're bringing in a probable L3 fracture with potential neurological damage." As they loaded Scott onto the stretcher, his eyes briefly focused, and he tried to speak. Marcus leaned close, straining to hear over the crowd noise and medical equipment. "Emma," Scott whispered, the single word carrying all his fear and love. "Tell Emma. I made the 8. "You sure did, brother," Marcus replied, his voice breaking. "Best damn ride of your career." The ambulance screamed through the streets of San Antonio, its lights painting the February darkness in red and blue while paramedics worked to keep Scott stable. In the back of the vehicle, surrounded by monitors and medical equipment, The cowboy who had walked into that arena believing he was 8 seconds away from glory now fought for something far more basic: the ability to ever feel his legs again. At University Hospital, Dr. Sarah Martinez was already scrubbing in for emergency surgery when the ambulance arrived. The X-rays taken in the emergency room confirmed her worst fears: severe damage to the L3 vertebra, with bone fragments dangerously close to the spinal cord. The swelling around the injury site made it impossible to determine the full extent of the neurological damage, but the early signs were devastating. "We need to operate immediately," she told the surgical team. "The longer we wait, the less chance we have of preserving any function below the injury site." In the waiting room, the rodeo community began to gather. Cowboys still in their competition clothes, stock contractors who had worked with Scot for years, and announcers who had called his rides arrived in waves, creating an impromptu vigil that would last for days. They brought coffee that grew cold, shared stories that grew more precious with each telling, and maintained the silent watch that was tradition when one of their own was fighting for his life. Ray Dowson, Scot's father, arrived from Bandera with dirt still under his fingernails from the ranch work he'd abandoned when Marcus called. At 64, Ray had buried too many friends who had died chasing the same dream that now had his son fighting for his future. He sat beside Sarah and Emma, 3 generations of a family suddenly bound together by disaster. "He was always going to try that bull," Ray said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "I could see it in his eyes when Thunder was first brought to the circuit. Scot always said that some bulls choose their riders and Thunder chose him. Why did he have to choose Daddy?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old mind struggling to understand how the sport that had made her father a hero could also destroy him. Before anyone could answer, Dr. Martinez emerged from the operating room, still wearing her surgical scrubs. Her expression was carefully controlled, but her eyes carried the weight of news that would change everything for the Dowson family. "The surgery went as well as could be expected," she began, her voice gentle but clinical. "We were able to stabilize the fracture and remove the bone fragments that were pressing on the spinal cord. However, there was significant damage to the nerve tissue. The next 72 hours will be critical in determining the extent of permanent neurological damage." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, though her nursing background had already provided the answer she didn't want to hear. "It means we don't know yet if he'll walk again. The swelling needs to subside before we can assess function below the injury site. I wish I could give you more definitive answers, but spinal cord injuries are unpredictable. We need to prepare for multiple possible outcomes." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. In the space of 8 seconds, Scot Dowson had gone from pursuing his lifelong dream to facing the possibility that he might never walk again. The cowboy who had spent his entire adult life on the backs of animals that wanted to destroy him had finally met his match in a bull named Thunder, and the price of that encounter was still being calculated. As the family settled in for their vigil, the video of Scot's ride began circulating on social media. Slow-motion replays showed Thunder's violent final move and the devastating impact that followed, viewed by millions of people who would never understand that behind the spectacular footage was a man whose world had just been reduced to the sterile confines of a hospital room and the uncertain hope that tomorrow might be different from today. The San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo continued its run, but the arena felt different. Cowboys who had never thought twice about climbing onto dangerous bulls found themselves hesitating at the chute gates, remembering the sound of Scot's body hitting that wall. Thunder was retired from competition immediately, his career ending with the same violent finality that had characterized every one of his rides. In the ICU, Scot Dowson lay unconscious, connected to machines that breathed for him and monitored the vital signs that meant the difference between life and something less than life. His room filled with flowers from fellow competitors, get-well cards from fans across the country, and the constant presence of people who understood that when a cowboy falls, the entire community feels the impact. But the most important presence was the smallest one. Emma Dowson, still wearing her pink cowboy hat, sat beside her father's bed and held his motionless hand, talking to him about her day at school, her friends, and her absolute certainty that he would wake up soon because cowboys always get back up. She didn't know yet that sometimes, even when cowboys get back up, they have to learn an entirely different way to ride. If this story has already grabbed you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories. Dr. Sarah Martinez had delivered devastating news to families for 15 years, but telling an 8-year-old girl that her father might never walk again was a conversation that tested every ounce of her professional composure. Emma Dowson sat in the oversized hospital chair, her legs dangling above the floor, clutching a stuffed bull that had been a gift from the Rodeo gift shop just hours before her world changed forever. "Your daddy is very sick," Dr. Martinez said gently, kneeling to Emma's eye level. "The injury to his back is very serious, and it might mean that his legs won't work the same way they did before." Emma's face scrunched in concentration, processing information that shouldn't have been part of any child's vocabulary. "But Daddy's legs are strong. He can lift me up and spin me around. He taught me how to ride horses with those legs." Sarah Richardson felt her heart break for the second time that day as she watched her daughter struggle to understand a reality that she herself was barely accepting. As a registered nurse, Sarah understood the medical terminology that Dr. Martinez was carefully avoiding. Phrases like complete spinal cord transection and permanent paraplegia painted a picture that no parent wanted to see. "Sometimes when people get hurt very badly," Sarah explained, choosing her words carefully, "their bodies change. Daddy might need to use a wheelchair to get around, but that doesn't mean he loves you any less or that he's not still the same daddy you've always known." Through the ICU window, Scott remained unconscious, his face swollen beyond recognition from the traumatic brain injury that had accompanied his spinal cord damage. The machines surrounding his bed beeped and hummed with the rhythm of artificial life support, monitoring vital signs that fluctuated with each hour. The cowboy who had faced charging bulls without flinching now fought battles against his own body that were far more dangerous than any arena had ever presented. Marcus Rivera hadn't left the hospital since the accident. Still wearing his competition clothes from the rodeo, he sat in the corner of the waiting room, replaying the events of the evening in his mind with the obsessive repetition of someone searching for a different outcome. The image of Scott's body crumpling against the arena wall was burned into his memory with the clarity of a photograph. "I should have stopped him," Marcus whispered to Ray Dowson, who sat beside him with the patient stillness of a man who had spent decades around unpredictable animals. "I knew Thunder was different. I felt it when they loaded him into the chute. That bull had something dark in him." "Thunder did what bulls do," Ray replied, his voice carrying the wisdom of 40 years in rodeo. "And Scott did what cowboys do. Neither one of them had a choice in the matter. Some things are just meant to happen, and fighting against fate is like trying to rope the wind." The waiting room filled steadily with members of the rodeo community who had driven through the night to be there. Danny Chun, the rodeo coordinator, brought Sarah a manila envelope containing insurance paperwork that would soon become a bureaucratic nightmare. Stock contractors shared stories about Scott's legendary rides, his generosity with young competitors, and his unshakable belief that the next bull would finally bring him the championship he'd chased for 15 years. "Remember that ride in Fort Worth last year?" said Tommy Williams, a bullfighter who had worked hundreds of events with Scott. Scott drew Diablo Rojo, and that bull had sent 12 riders to the hospital in 6 months. But Scott lasted the full 8 and scored a 91. After he got off, he spent 2 hours helping some kid from New Mexico work on his riding technique. "That's Scott," added Maria Santos, a barrel racer from Austin. "Always thinking about the next generation. He used to say that rodeo wasn't just about individual glory. It was about keeping the tradition alive for the kids who came after us." As the hours passed, the vigil took on the characteristics of a wake for someone who wasn't dead yet. Cowboys shared memories that grew more precious with each telling, spoke in whispers about Scott's chances of recovery, and avoided discussing the obvious question that hung over everything. What happened to a professional bull rider who could no longer feel his legs? At 3:17 a.m., Dr. Martinez emerged from the ICU with an expression that made everyone in the waiting room stand up simultaneously. The news she carried would determine whether the family was planning for a difficult recovery or preparing for something far worse. "There's been some additional swelling in his brain," she announced, her voice steady but grave. "We need to operate immediately to relieve the pressure. The procedure is risky, but without it, he won't survive the night." The words hit the waiting room like a physical force. Ray Dowson closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that he hadn't said since his own riding accident decades earlier. Sarah pulled Emma closer, trying to shield her daughter from the reality that they might lose Scott entirely before they had a chance to fight for whatever pieces of him might be saved. As they wheeled Scott toward the operating room for the second time in 12 hours, Marcus caught a glimpse of his friend's face through the crowd of medical personnel. Even unconscious, even swollen and bruised beyond recognition. Scot's expression held the same determination he'd shown climbing onto Thunder's back. It was the face of a man who had never backed down from a fight, even when the odds were stacked impossibly against him. The second surgery lasted 6 hours. In the waiting room, the rodeo community maintained their vigil with the patient endurance of people who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Cowboys dozed in uncomfortable chairs, awakening every time a nurse passed through with updates. Stock contractors made phone calls to cancel Scot's upcoming competitions, their voices heavy with the unspoken knowledge that those cancellations might be permanent. Dawn was breaking over San Antonio when Dr. Martinez finally emerged from the operating room, her surgical scrubs stained with evidence of the battle she'd been fighting. The expression on her face carried news that would reshape everything the Dowson family thought they knew about their future. The surgery was successful in relieving the pressure on his brain, she began, addressing the crowd that had gathered in the waiting room. However, the combination of the traumatic brain injury and the spinal cord damage presents challenges we need to discuss honestly. She led the family to a private consultation room where medical charts and X-rays told the story of a body pushed beyond its limits. The images showed vertebrae compressed like crushed cans, nerve pathways severed with surgical precision, and brain tissue swollen against the skull's protective barrier. Even if Scot regains consciousness, Dr. Martinez continued, the damage to his spinal cord appears to be complete at the L3 level. This means permanent paralysis from the waist down. Additionally, the brain injury could result in cognitive changes, memory loss, personality alterations, difficulty with coordination and speech. The clinical language couldn't mask the devastating reality of what she was describing. The Scot Dowson who had walked into that arena believing he was 8 seconds away from glory would never exist again, regardless of whether the man in the ICU bed survived his injuries. What are his chances? Sarah asked, her nursing training allowing her to process medical information that would have overwhelmed most parents. Of surviving? Good, assuming there are no additional complications. Of recovery to anything resembling his previous level of function? I have to be honest with you, that's unlikely. We're looking at extensive rehabilitation, adaptive equipment, permanent lifestyle changes. This isn't the kind of injury people bounce back from. Outside the consultation room, Emma had fallen asleep in Marcus's arms, her small body exhausted by emotional trauma that no 8-year-old should have to endure. Her pink cowboy hat sat askew on her head, a cheerful reminder of the excitement she'd felt just hours earlier, watching her father compete in the sport that had now destroyed him. Ray Dowson stared out the hospital window at the San Antonio skyline, thinking about the ranch in Bandera that had been in his family for 3 generations. The medical bills would pile up quickly, the insurance would cover some expenses but not all, and the family would be left to figure out how to rebuild their lives around a reality none of them had ever imagined. "We'll make it work," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. "Somehow we'll make it work." But as the sun rose over the city where Scot Dowson's career had ended in the span of 8 seconds, everyone in that waiting room understood that making it work would require redefining everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be a cowboy, a father, and a man whose identity had been built entirely around doing something he would never be able to do again. The machines in Scot's room continued their electronic vigil, monitoring the vital signs of a man caught between the life he'd lived and whatever uncertain future waited on the other side of consciousness. Outside his window, the world continued its normal rhythm, unaware that in room 347 of University Hospital, a family was learning that sometimes the price of chasing dreams is higher than anyone should ever have to pay. 23 days after the accident, Scot Dowson's eyes opened to a world that made no sense. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No arena crowds, no bulls snorting in nearby chutes, no familiar sounds of the rodeo life that had defined his existence for 15 years. Instead, there was only the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room that had become his entire universe. "Welcome back, cowboy." Dr. Martinez's voice carried a mixture of relief and caution that Scot would later learn was standard for traumatic brain injury patients. She'd seen too many people wake up from comas to celebrate prematurely, understanding that consciousness was just the first step in a journey that might lead nowhere. Scot tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper after weeks of intubation. The whisper that emerged was barely audible. "What happened to me?" It was Emma who answered, her small voice cutting through the medical explanations that the adults were preparing. "Daddy, you got hurt really bad on Thunder. But you're awake now, so everything's going to be okay." Scot turned his head slowly, feeling dizzy from the simple movement, and saw his daughter sitting beside his bed. She looked older somehow, her 8-year-old face carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. She was holding his hand, and for a moment, he felt relief that he could feel her small fingers against his palm. Then he tried to move his legs. The absence of sensation was so complete it felt like his lower body belonged to someone else. Scot stared down at his legs under the hospital blanket, willing them to move, to twitch, to give any sign of life. Nothing. The paralysis was so absolute that he couldn't even tell if his legs were straight or bent without looking at them. "I can't." He started but couldn't finish the sentence. Dr. Martinez moved closer, her expression professionally compassionate. "Scot, the injury to your spinal cord was severe. There's been significant damage to the nerve pathways at the L3 level. We've done everything medically possible, but the paralysis appears to be permanent." The word hit him like a physical blow. Permanent. Not temporary, not something that would heal with time and therapy, but permanent. Forever. The career that had defined him, the physical identity he'd built over decades, the simple ability to walk across a room, all of it gone in 8 seconds. "No," he said, his voice gaining strength from desperation. "That's not. I have to ride again. The championship is in 3 months. I can't miss it." Sarah Richardson, who had maintained a bedside vigil for 3 weeks, gently took his other hand. Despite their divorce 2 years earlier, she had never stopped loving the essential goodness in Scot that made him the kind of man who would help strangers and always put Emma's needs first, even when his addiction to adrenaline had destroyed their marriage. "Scot, you almost died," she said softly. "The doctors didn't think you were going to wake up. Everything else is secondary to the fact that you're here with us." But Scot wasn't listening. His entire identity was built around being a bull rider. It wasn't just what he did for a living, it was who he was at his core. Without that, without the ability to feel 1,500 pounds of angry muscle beneath him, who was he? What was he? Over the following days, as Scot's cognitive function slowly improved, the full scope of his situation became clear. The traumatic brain injury had affected his short-term memory and coordination. Simple tasks like eating required concentration that exhausted him. Physical therapy sessions revealed the extent of the paralysis, complete loss of sensation and motor function from the waist down. David Kim, his physical therapist, was a former Army medic who had worked with traumatic injuries in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian rehabilitation. He approached Scot's case with military directness that cut through any illusions about what recovery would look like. "Your upper body strength is excellent," David reported during their first session. "Your brain injury is healing well, and your coordination is improving daily. But we need to be clear about what we're working toward. You're going to be in a wheelchair permanently. The question is whether you want to be independent in that wheelchair or spend the rest of your life needing help with basic functions." "I don't want to be in a wheelchair at all," Scot replied, his voice flat with depression. "I want to ride bulls. That's all I've ever wanted to do." "Then you need to figure out what you want to do instead," David said without sympathy. "Because that option doesn't exist anymore." The visits from the rodeo community, meant to be encouraging, often left Scot feeling worse. Cowboys who had competed against him for years brought get-well cards and stories about his greatest rides. Stock contractors offered jobs working with animals from the ground level. Announcers promised him spots in broadcast booths whenever he was ready. But every suggestion felt like a consolation prize. Scot didn't want to be around rodeo if he couldn't compete. Being close to the sport that had defined him while being unable to participate felt like torture rather than comfort. Marcus Rivera, who visited every other day despite his own competition schedule, bore the brunt of Scot's anger and frustration. Their friendship, built on shared experiences in the arena, now felt strained by the reality of Scot's situation. "They want to retire Thunder," Marcus said during one visit, thinking the news might provide some sense of closure. "The stock contractor says it's the right thing to do after what happened." "Good," Scot replied bitterly. "At least one of us gets to retire on top." The comment hit Marcus like a slap. "You think this is funny? You think any of this is easy for the rest of us? Watching you like this is killing all of us, Scot. We'd trade places with you in a heartbeat if we could." "No, you wouldn't," Scot shot back. "Nobody would want this. Nobody would want to be the guy who used to ride bulls, but now can't even feel his own legs. Emma's visits were the only bright spots in Scot's increasingly dark world. At 8 years old, she approached her father's injury with the adaptability of childhood, treating his wheelchair as simply another part of him, like his eye color or his voice. She brought him drawings of horses and cowboys, read him stories from school, and chattered about her friends who thought it was cool that her dad was a famous bull rider. "Daddy, when you come home, can you still teach me to ride?" she asked during one visit, her eyes bright with the assumption that life would eventually return to normal. The question broke something inside Scot. The ranch in Bandera, with its practice bulls and riding arenas, was still there, waiting for a cowboy who would never come home. The entire operation that had been his livelihood was now just an expensive reminder of his former life. "Sweetheart," he said carefully, "those bulls are dangerous. Maybe we should think about other things you might like to do. But you promised. You said when I got bigger, you'd teach me everything about being a cowboy." Sarah intervened before Scot could respond, but the damage was done. That night, alone in his hospital room, Scot confronted the full scope of what his accident had cost him. Not just his career or his physical abilities, but his role as Emma's hero. How could he teach her to chase her dreams when his own had ended in catastrophe? The depression that followed was deeper than anything Scot had ever experienced. He stopped participating in physical therapy sessions, barely spoke to visitors, and spent most of his time staring out the window at a parking lot where people with working legs walked to their cars and drove away to lives that still made sense. Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital psychologist, was direct in a way that reminded Scot of his father's no-nonsense approach to life. "You're grieving," she told him during their first session. "You're mourning the death of your old life, and that's completely normal. But at some point, you have to decide whether you're going to build a new life or spend the rest of your time feeling sorry for yourself." "Easy for you to say," Scot replied. "You can still walk." "You're right, I can. But I've worked with hundreds of patients who've faced similar challenges, and I can tell you that the ones who find meaning again aren't necessarily the ones who had the least severe injuries. They're the ones who decided that their lives were worth more than what they'd lost." The conversation planted a seed that would take weeks to grow, but it marked the beginning of Scot's slow recognition that his choice wasn't between his old life and death. It was between finding a new way to live and giving up entirely. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Ray Dowson, who had been making the 2-hour drive from Bandera every weekend despite his own health problems, brought news that hit Scot harder than any medical diagnosis. "I might have to sell the ranch," Ray said quietly, the words carrying the weight of family history spanning 3 generations. "The medical bills are piling up, and with you not able to work, I can't afford to keep it going." The Dowson Ranch had been home to 3 generations of cowboys. Scot's great-grandfather had built the original house with his own hands, and every generation since had added to it, improved it, made it more than just a place to live. It was the repository of family history, the place where Scot had learned to ride, where he'd dreamed of teaching Emma the traditions that connected them to something larger than themselves. "Dad, no. We'll figure something out. There has to be another way. The insurance money helps, but it won't be enough. Not for the kind of long-term care you're going to need. Not for Emma's future. I've talked to a developer who's interested in the land. Maybe it's time." That night, Scot called Marcus for the first time since his accident, asking him to do something that would either mark the end of his connection to his former life or the beginning of something entirely different. "I need you to make a video of the ranch," he said. "Everything. The practice arena, the bulls, Dad's trophy room, all of it. If we're going to lose it, I want Emma to see what it was like." When Marcus brought the finished video 2 days later, Scot watched it alone in his hospital room. Seeing the empty practice arena where he'd spent countless hours preparing for competition, seeing the photographs of 3 generations of Dowson cowboys on the walls of his father's study, something shifted inside him. The ranch wasn't just buildings and land. It was the physical embodiment of a legacy that stretched back decades. And for the first time since waking up, Scot began to think about something other than what he'd lost. He started to think about what he might still be able to save. 6 months after the accident, Scot Dowson sat in his wheelchair at the kitchen table of the Bandera Ranch house, surrounded by spreadsheets, business plans, and a laptop computer that had become his new arena. The financial reality was brutal. Mounting medical bills, lost income from his inability to compete, and the crushing weight of maintaining a ranch operation designed around a career that no longer existed. But something had changed in Scot's thinking during those months of rehabilitation. The ranch that had once seemed like a monument to his failure was starting to look like an opportunity for something revolutionary. Instead of a place where he used to train for bull riding, it could become a place where people like him learned to live again. Adaptive rodeo, he said to Marcus, who was helping him work through the business proposal that would either save the ranch or represent the last desperate act of a man unwilling to accept reality. There are thousands of people in Texas who've been told they can't participate in rodeo because of physical limitations. Veterans, accident victims, people born with disabilities. What if we created a place where they could compete? Marcus studied the plans spread across the table, his expression skeptical but interested. You're talking about modifying everything, the arena, the equipment, the events themselves. That's a massive undertaking, Scott. And there's no guarantee anyone would come. They'll come, Scott said with the first genuine conviction he'd felt since waking up in the hospital. I've been contacted by over 100 people since word got out about what I'm thinking. They all want the same thing I wanted when I was lying in that hospital bed. A chance to compete again. The idea had started with a letter from a Marine veteran named James Sullivan, who had lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan but had grown up on a ranch in East Texas. James wrote about watching Scott's accident on video and feeling a connection to someone whose physical limitations now matched his own. But instead of sympathy, James's letter contained a challenge. If you can figure out how to make rodeo work for people like us, I'll be your first student. That letter had led to dozens of others, then hundreds. Parents of children with spina bifida who dreamed of barrel racing. Stroke survivors who missed the competition that had once defined their lives. Amputees who wanted to prove that physical limitations didn't have to mean the end of their connection to Western sports. Emma, now 9 years old and fully adapted to her father's wheelchair, had become an unofficial consultant on the project. Her perspective as someone who had never seen disability as limiting helped Scott think beyond traditional boundaries. What about people who can't hold reins with their hands? She asked one evening as they worked on design plans. How would they steer their horses? It was exactly the kind of question that pushed Scott to innovate. Working with occupational therapists from the rehabilitation hospital, they developed adaptive equipment that allowed people with various levels of mobility to participate safely in modified rodeo events. The response from the medical community was immediate and enthusiastic. Dr. James Rodriguez, who ran the spinal cord injury program at University Hospital, became an early supporter. What Scott is proposing isn't just recreation, he told the local newspaper. It's therapy. Physical rehabilitation is just the beginning of recovery. Emotional and psychological healing often comes from finding new ways to engage with activities that define who we are. But enthusiasm didn't pay bills. The modifications needed to transform the ranch into an adaptive rodeo facility would cost nearly $200,000. Equipment, arena modifications, insurance, staff training. The financial requirements were staggering for a family already struggling with medical debt. The loan application to First National Bank of San Antonio was a make-or-break moment. Scott wheeled into the bank's conference room wearing his best-dressed shirt and the black cowboy hat that had somehow survived Thunder's assault, carrying a business plan that represented either salvation or the final chapter of his family's ranching legacy. "Mr. Dowson," said Margaret Chin, the loan officer reviewing his application, "I have to be honest with you. A loan of this size, given your current physical limitations and the uncertainty of your income potential, represents a significant risk for the bank. Ma'am, with all due respect, what I'm proposing isn't just about me trying to save my family's ranch," Scott replied, his voice carrying the confidence he'd once brought to the arena. "We're talking about creating the first adaptive rodeo facility in the Southwest. The adaptive sports market is growing by 15% annually. There are thousands of people in Texas who want to compete, and their families want to support them." He opened his laptop and showed her testimonials from potential students, financial projections based on similar facilities in other states, and endorsements from medical professionals who understood the therapeutic value of adaptive sports. The presentation lasted 3 hours. When it was over, Margaret promised to present Scott's proposal to the loan committee within a week. A week later, she called with news that would determine whether the Dowson Ranch would survive into the next generation. "Mr. Dowson, I'm pleased to inform you that your loan has been approved," she said. "The committee was impressed by your business plan and your commitment to serving an underserved population." Construction began immediately. The traditional practice arena was widened to accommodate wheelchairs, with ramps installed at strategic points. The mechanical bull was replaced with a custom-designed adaptive version that could accommodate riders with varying levels of physical function while still providing the authentic 8-second challenge. "It has to be real," Scott explained to the engineer designing the equipment. "These folks don't want a watered-down version of Rodeo. They want to feel what we feel, the adrenaline, the challenge, the 8 seconds that make everything else worthwhile." The grand opening of Dowson Adaptive Rodeo was scheduled for March 15th, exactly 1 year after Scott's accident. The date was chosen deliberately, not to commemorate the tragedy, but to celebrate what had grown from it. The facility drew competitors from across the Southwest: Marine veterans from El Paso, teenagers with cerebral palsy from Houston, stroke survivors from Dallas who had never given up their love of competition. Sarah and Emma were in the crowd of over 300 people who gathered to witness the first adaptive rodeo competition in Texas history. Sarah had remarried the previous year to a pediatrician named Michael, but she brought Emma to every event at the ranch, understanding that Scott's relationship with their daughter transcended their divorce. "Ladies and gentlemen," Scott announced from his position at the center of the arena, his voice carried by a wireless microphone, "welcome to a new chapter in the story of American rodeo. Today we prove that the spirit of competition, the courage to face challenges, and the determination to ride again can overcome any obstacle." The first event was adaptive barrel racing, with competitors navigating the course in racing wheelchairs, on horseback with modified saddles, and using hand controls designed for people with varying levels of mobility. The winner was Maria Santos, a former trick rider who had been paralyzed in a car accident 3 years earlier. Her time of 18.3 seconds would have been competitive in any traditional barrel racing event. But it was the final event that brought the crowd to its feet. Adaptive bull riding, performed on the specially designed mechanical bull, with competitors secured by adaptive equipment that allowed them to experience the 8-second challenge that had defined traditional rodeo for over a century. Scott was the final rider of the day, the man who had inspired the entire event by refusing to accept that his rodeo career was over just because it had to take a different form. As he transferred from his wheelchair to the adaptive bull, the arena fell silent except for the mechanical hum of the equipment. "This one's for everyone who's been told they can't," he said into his microphone. "This one's for every dreamer who's had to find a new way to chase the same dream." The mechanical bull began its programmed routine, bucking and spinning with controlled violence that mimicked the movement of real bulls. Scott's body moved with the practiced rhythm of a man who had spent his life reading the movements of bucking animals, his adaptive equipment keeping him secure while still providing the authentic challenge of staying mounted. 8 seconds had never felt so long or so important. When the buzzer sounded, Scott raised his free hand in triumph, and the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the Texas hill country. Emma ran onto the arena floor, her face glowing with pride. "Daddy, you did it! You rode again!" "We all did, sweetheart," Scott replied, gesturing toward the other competitors who had gathered around them. "We all found a way to ride again." In the months that followed, Dowson Adaptive Rodeo became a model for similar facilities across the country. Scott was invited to speak at medical conferences, disability rights conventions, and rodeo associations about the intersection of traditional Western sports and adaptive athletics. The ranch that had almost been lost to medical bills became the centerpiece of a movement that expanded the definition of what it meant to be a cowboy. Thunder, the bull that had changed everything, lived out his retirement on a ranch in Oklahoma. Scott never saw him again, but he didn't need to. The lesson Thunder had taught him, that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most devastating defeats, had become the foundation of everything he built afterward. 2 years after the accident, Emma Dowson won the Youth Adaptive Barrel Racing Championship at the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo, riding a horse named Thunder's Legacy. Scott called her ride from the announcer's booth, his voice carrying across the arena as he introduced her. "Ladies and gentlemen, proving that the spirit of rodeo truly runs in families, please give it up for Emma Dowson, representing the next generation of Dowson champions." The crowd's cheers were deafening, echoing off the arena walls like the sound of possibility itself. For Scott, watching his daughter compete in the same arena where his own career had ended, the noise was loud enough to drown out the memory of that sickening crack that had once seemed like the end of everything. Instead, it had turned out to be just the beginning of a different kind of story altogether. One where Thunder's violent gift had taught them all that sometimes the greatest victories require learning an entirely new way to ride. If this story has already grabbed you, subscribe to the channel, and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories.